Hi. Thank you everyone for being here and for joining this panel. Um, as you know, we are going to be talking about what really mental health means in corporates. Are we really sort of talking about it from, just a checkbox on the inclusion list? Are we actually in corporates really empathetic? Do we understand? Is it something that leadership identifies with? Or is it just a checkbox because it's cool to talk about it? So I have with me Priti and of course Aparna. And I think the first question I want to ask both of them, are we really serious when we talk about mental health in corporates? What have you both seen in your experiences? Priti, let's start with you.
Okay, so one is when we talk about corporates, there could be for-profit corporates and then there are non-for-profits. But so I'll call it organizations, although both behave in the same manner in my experience of working in both spaces when it comes to mental health. So there is a conversation on mental health that has started over the last 2 years, but it's limiting to say that an individual has personal issues which they bring to workplaces. So what can organizations do to handle those issues or support those issues? And with this perspective in mind, most organizations that are providing some kind of services are doing counseling services and mindfulness exercises and fun Fridays. We also do some of those. I think there is no understanding of mental health from the perspective that workplaces themselves could be stressors and could be causing some of those mental health issues. For now, at least that much.
Fun Fridays, Aparna, do they help?
I had a lovely quote from someone who's an expert on workplace mental health, and she said that, fun Fridays and yoga classes is like asking somebody who's drowning to swim, to learn how to swim. So the thing is, if you have so many of these workplace stressors, which all of you are very young, and I don't like to paint a picture of the workplace being very stressful, especially at this part of your career. But the point is, there is a lot about the workplace that can be very stressful, as Priti mentioned. And I think that fun Fridays or yoga or just leaving it up to the individual to cope with the problem is not a realistic expectation. It makes the corporate feel good that something is being done, because I think corporates also are very action-based and activity-based. So they want to see activity happen and they think that some result has been achieved. But it's not such a simple equation.
But why should, but technically, why should your workplace really sort of care about your mental health issues? Is that something that why should the onus shift on them? Isn't it your own responsibility to manage your mental well-being?
Yes, partly, but not if you have a toxic boss, not if you have, workplace deadlines which are unreasonable, not if you're having to go into therapy because your workplace is so difficult, not if you have to deal with office politics. These are not in your control. So ultimately, mental health in the workplace, according to me, is a combination of many stakeholders, which I think Priti would also agree with. It's the role of the individual for sure. It's the role of the manager, the role of the teams, the role of the leadership and the culture. So there are many elements to it. And ultimately, why should the corporate care is because it affects employee productivity and motivation, apart from the human angle and the angle of being empathetic. Leave that aside for a moment, but the productivity issue is costing a lot. In fact, recently there was a report from Deloitte which said that Indian firms lost $14 billion on account of poor mental health in the last 1 year. That's a huge amount, it's a huge amount, and it affects the economies, it affects people around us. So it's a very tangible impact that companies experience in terms of their biggest asset.
Priti, will you add to that? I mean,
Sure.
why should company culture, how does that really impact?
Yeah, so I'll do that and I'll also answer the question you asked, why should organizations do it? I think organizations need to do it because it's the rights of employees to have a workplace or working conditions that are conducive to them performing to their full potential. I think there's a need to move away from productivity being the primary reason for investment in mental health, because when you do that, you're putting the pressure on HR teams, which usually manage this, to say there's actually a productivity improvement. When you talk it from a lens of rights, you say this is required because it's supposed to be done. In fact, mental health is a right as per the Mental Health Care Act. And when we therefore talk about if you want to provide this to your employees, what would it mean in terms of providing it? So like I said, our most conversations today on workplace mental health are at the individual level. So it's a personal issue of the individual that the individual is bringing to workplace. Or as Aparna was saying, usually it's the workplaces that could be causing the personal issue. As MHI, we look at this at 3 levels. So we say one, definitely it's an individual level issue. You need to provide counseling services, support, or any other support that the individual may require. But it's also an organizational level issue. What is the culture that you have? What is the policies that you have? What are the practices that you have that are not inclusive, that are discriminatory to certain cohorts and groups, that then experience this workplace mental health issue, and some individual within those cohorts may experience it much more than others. So an example which most people understand is if you have new management trainees coming into your workforce, not every management trainee's experience of the first day would be the same. There would be one who's from the same city, will find it easier to come to your work office. There could be somebody from a rural area who may just find it so difficult to reach your workplace. Are you taking care of those through your onboarding policies? And I think the third level is certain industries are by itself functioning in a manner that cause more distress.
Priti, let me stop you there. If I'm hearing it correctly, are you suggesting that, or are you saying that something like mental health should fall into, when they plan their diversity and inclusion? By the way, that's a huge sort of segment these days in many organizations. Do you think mental health should sit under the inclusion bucket, and the policies that they frame and other things should come there?
Yes, I think it needs to fall under diversity and inclusion. And when we talk about diversity and inclusion, you look at it saying that the more diverse your teams are, the better you will function. There is enough research that says that diverse boards having more women representation, diverse teams give you better return on investment, and as a finance person, over the long run, you want to look at those. So that is true. And I think if you take an inclusion lens, you will start realizing what are your practices that are harming certain cohorts. And therefore, yes, it needs to fall under disability in terms of saying what are reasonable accommodations that disability policies need to have, look at mental health equivalent to that, and have it more not just as a tick mark, but as a way of working.
I'll come to you, Aparna, but one thing I just wanted to check, is it enough to then say if it's under my inclusion budget or it's under my this thing, maybe in my insurance policy or health insurance policy I can include some sort of mental health package, and is that enough then as an organization?
No, you need to look at inclusion beyond policy. Inclusion is a way you function. It's not just hiring few people under a criteria. So I'll say, why not say every role of yours is open for everybody, and we will take affirmative actions in hiring, rather than saying some rules.
So Aparna, do you agree with diversity and inclusion being the bracket or the bucket under which mental health issues can be placed?
Theoretically, I would say I agree with Priti that, one should have rights in the office and one should have these issues. But from a practical perspective, I would say no, because, coming from a business background, I know that business people want to see things in terms of their returns on investment and the impact. So for example, I was speaking to one person who was going to engage me for a speaking engagement. And so we were just talking about mental health, and then I said, how many people in your organization? He said 20,000. So I said, it's quite possible that 4,000 to 5,000 of these people either have a mental health condition or that they are dealing with somebody with that. And that got his attention. to realize that so many of his people actually might be having a condition. And again, going back to the lens of performance, which may be a crude indicator, but I just think in our very kind of financially oriented, bottom line oriented world, that is what people are judged by. That got his attention because it said, okay, this is a huge number and I need to do something about it. If I'm just merely, looking at diversity and inclusion, while I would love mental health to be looked at with the same seriousness as we look at gender and sexuality, and those, other criteria, I just think that this one gets their attention a lot more, because it looks at performance in a more direct way.
One myth that corporates really believe about mental health is it that it's not anything to do with us, you're bringing it and we'll help you, but that's about it. Or that we didn't create this issue, it's there, I mean, you've got to deal with it. Is there any other myth like that about mental health that you find often sort of?
There is no such thing as mental health. I think that if you go, let's be honest, I think if you look at above a certain generation, they're not used to talking about their feelings, right? They're not used to be talking about they're not talking, you say the word vulnerability to them or say the word mental health to them and they're like, what's that? We have not experienced this. And so I think that these are people also in a leadership position. It's not just the startups and the younger generation. So I think that's something itself that we need to point out, that mental health is something that's different, distinct from personality. That there is something that's a diagnosable condition or a diagnosable illness. It's not a permanent issue. It comes and it goes. These are all aspects of mental health that I think we have to explain.
Priti, what about privacy? Don't most organizations think that mental health is linked to privacy? Why should we talk about it openly in the workplace? It becomes very difficult. It's like a Pandora's box. Once you open it, how do you put it back?
So I think organizations are currently not thinking about privacy, and that's an issue because they need to think about it. That what does your policy say about who should know about the mental health issues that an employee may be experiencing? How much should others know? And if I draw upon that and also your previous question, I think the myth workplaces have is that if you have a person with mental health issues in your team, productivity will be impacted, and to have affirmative policy in place would mean that your productivity will fall. And as MHI, I have a large portion of my team who are people with mental health issues. And we say very clearly that we as an organization will provide you reasonable accommodation, which means we will create flexibilities for you to perform to your full potential and for you to perform your role. But you are accountable to your role. So it doesn't need to impact productivity. Having a workplace mental health policy means you recognize that different people will work in different manners, will need reasonable accommodations, and can you provide that, making them accountable for accountability and making yourself accountable for providing the working environment.
So we've talked a lot about what corporates should or should not do. What about employees? Do you think they find it safe, psychologically safe to go and talk to their boss's boss, even their own colleagues about a specific mental health issue they may be facing?
I don't think so. And you start looking at, and because I talk about it in lens of inclusion, look at how many organizations actually receive complaints under POSH. And if you're not receiving complaints under POSH, it does not mean that harassment is not happening. It just means you have not created the space for people to disclose it. And why should somebody disclose it today? What's the benefit that person will get from, apart from being labeled that you are not productive enough, you are going to ask for more flexibilities, I won't get my ROI from your being an employee. So there's no incentive for a person to disclose it. There's no safe space for it.
Aparna, I know you have a framework for psychological safety in the workplace. Is that something you can elaborate on?
Yeah, I think we're just trying to develop this idea of who is responsible for psychological safety. Is it what are the role of the employee and what is the role of the manager? what is the role of teams, and what is the role of HR, and what is the role of leadership. So if you look at all of these 5 different stakeholders, I think there is, what we're really trying to say is all of these people have certain responsibilities. It's not that you can actually leave it to any of these individuals to look at it independently. And there has to be alignment between all of these in terms of it. Just an analogy for that, the way I would look at it is, workplace flexibility is such a big topic right now because of COVID and us going back to work. If you look at all of these stakeholders, they would apply for workplace flexibility. It's only when you have the alignment between everybody, right, where the leadership agrees, the HR kind of has a policy, the employee is following that policy, there's the manager knows what to expect of the employee, and that's all based on a certain level of trust. And that's the same thing with psychological safety, right? That you need to have that alignment. That relationship with the manager is I would say out of all of these 5 stakeholders, the relationship with the manager is the most important, because if they are not understanding, and I don't know, Seema, if we can share our incident also. If we can. So Seema and I actually worked together for 10 years. She was my boss at the Mint. We started working together, I think, in 2009, and it was in 2012 or 13 that I disclosed to her that I was bipolar. And that was because, honestly, the shit had hit the roof, like there was no way that I could avoid telling her that I had these issues. I was behind on my deadlines, and it was putting her into a difficult space. So in this, going back to that framework, and I look at it, it was really, it was not necessarily because I felt safe or unsafe, but because of that crisis precipitated that conversation, So the question of it really arises as to when that employee feels that they can also start having that conversation. I think it's very important for employees to also start and share. If they don't do that, it's very difficult for employers to know what to happen. Seema can share how she felt when I first disclosed it.
I think 10 years ago, there was hardly any conversation around these things. So when she did tell me, I think, first of all, I didn't know, I was a journalist and all of that, but I didn't know what she meant when she said she's bipolar. So I had to actually look up what it meant. I had to talk to somebody to say, is she making it up or is it true? And when she told me, I think the only thing I did was I listened, and I think that was perhaps the best thing I could have done at that point, because if I didn't know something, I wasn't dismissive, or I just listened. I heard her through, and then I went and found out and understood. And I think the only thing that changed in our relationship after that was I made sure that if she had something that she had to deliver, she had a deadline which was longer than most people, or I always had a backup. So I think it was a tiny little adjustment in my head. I could have completely dropped her. She was a columnist, I didn't have to use her. But I think, I don't know what prompted me to do that, maybe someday we'll explore that. It's just that it was a minor adjustment in the way I functioned with her, which was to say, hey, I like what you write, but I also know that you can't always deliver it on the deadline that I need. So what I will do is I will always have a backup to your copy. Was that the psychological safety?
Yeah, I think so. I think the fact that she was not judgmental, and she did what Priti suggested, which is the accommodation. She accommodated me. Was giving that tremendous amount of psychological safety that we could have a much more open conversation. And believe me, if I am writing Chemical Khichdi today or talking about mental health openly, it's because my workplace has acknowledged it. Because until now, see, your friends and family will always acknowledge, and hopefully they will not judge you and they will give you the support. You'll never be able to hide it from them. But you can try and hide it from your workplace successfully or unsuccessfully, but the minute your workplace acknowledges it, then your life is pretty complete. Then you can really be yourself, And it wasn't also, it was the culture at Mint, I think, which lent itself to that, because Sukumar, who was Seema's boss at that time, I was messing up over there also. And I just then explained to him, and he said, when I was doing another assignment, he said, okay, I'll give you a second chance, but do it for me in like a week. And I said, no, I really need a month. And he said, okay, fine, take a month, So they were able to fit me in a way that worked for them and in a way that worked for me. So that gives a lot of psychological safety to the employee to know that you can have these conversations, you're not going to lose your job, you're not going to get fired, you still have a reputation that is better, and for the employer to know that yes, this person can be counted on, and this person is a valuable resource, and we do want to invest in them. So I think these are the real life examples of how it could work, and unfortunately we all know examples of when it hasn't been so easy.
So if you were to create this psychological safety, Priti, where does it really flow from? Is it something that can be built from ground up, or does it sort of need to come down from the top leadership?
I think it needs to start from the leadership. For the leadership to acknowledge that they have had experiences which were difficult for them, you need not, so when we talk about mental health, we say it's a continuum, starting from stress, distress. Some people get diagnosed by a psychiatrist, and then if you take a disability lens, disability. So even if you start talking about as leaders on stress and distress, when did they experience it? What worked for them? What did not work from them? I think the conversations begin. To put the entire onus on the employee to share it, because frankly speaking, I think Aparna, you were lucky to have Seema as a boss who could understand this, but most people don't have it. And we know ourselves that people around us who are in leadership positions in the corporates may not do it. So I think it needs to start from the leadership, flow through policies, practices and culture, and only then can employees be expected to share about it if you have enough safety in place and also enough policies to support reasonable accommodation.
So if there is safety, there is this thing, is there any responsibility that still rests with the employee?
I would not put that. I wouldn't. As an organization, can I ask my employees to share with me at the time of hiring or any other conversation that they have mental health issues? I wouldn't put that responsibility on them. It's for me to create space, and only if they feel safe, they should share it with me. If today somebody comes and asks me, should I share about my mental health issue in my corporate? I would say, don't. Don't, because you're not sure about how the organization will react. And assuming the best case scenario also, it would be neutral. So unless there's a affirmative workplace, it wouldn't be fair to put that on people. And looking at this crowd, which is much more younger, and therefore will not have the hierarchy to support that kind of power equation, I would say think before you disclose, understand what has happened, disclose, and even in the organization, like Aparna mentioned, who do you disclose to can be your boss and it can be still informal without disclosing it to the organization, right? So, no, I wouldn't risk putting it on, the onus on the employee.
What about you, Aparna? What do you think?
I mean, just being in that position, I can just say, you know, if you're lucky enough to have a culture which you think you have a sense that you can trust them. Bipolarity, you know, even 5 years ago was on my resume. You know, I literally, when I started working with a new employer, I would say, whether it was a Mint or even outside, some things might happen, you're taking me on, I want you to know about it. Because things do happen, you know, and if you know that at least you've been open, then at least they have a chance to work it out and they have some sort of forewarning. And if you're really going in for an employer who's not at all open to that, then do you want to be working for those people in any case? You know, do you really want to be doing that? So I think a little bit of faith is good, but you know, like I come from a family where my sister is out, she's gay, you know, I'm bipolar, we're out. Like it's benefited us in our personal lives to be so open about who we are. And when I talk to young people and they're willing to tell me about, you know, and go on social media or something and say that they are bipolar and all that. But sometimes I also feel with you guys it's a little extreme that you're all bipolar and you all have ADHD and you all have, you know, anxiety, and people say that very casually also. So I think you have to be find that balance between having a proper diagnosis and being completely kind of casual about it.
Any questions at this point?
Right, so I was a bit like after listening to Miss Priti, right? I wanted to ask, like here we are talking about like big organizations, like those who have a proper program and proper departments to take care of your mental illness and mental health. But what about those organizations? Those have just started, right? Like startups. Those don't really have those departments that can take care of employees' mental health. Me personally, I've started working and did not have a personal life at all because those startups need you to give your full to the organization. But then how does that, how does the employee find a balance in a work life, your work life circle and your personal life? Because honestly, I felt like I was put in a box where I could not come out of it, where I could not talk about it very safely.
Sure. So one is, I have worked for large organizations in for-profit space. Today as MHI, we have around 20 people working for us. In fact, it's easier for an organization to do it when they're smaller because you can have a policy in place. And for those who are here as entrepreneurs or heads of organizations, I would say go on our website, take our policy, give us credit for our policy, implement whatever you think you can. In terms of you as an employee, like Aparna said, think about, do you want to work for an organization that doesn't give you what you're looking on for? And there's a question of balance. Unfortunately, some of it, like for me, came a balance. This question came much more later in my life to ask about work-life balance. You're going to be challenged by it far ahead of the curve, I will say. So yeah, it's to say that you will need to bring a balance. And when you say you need to bring a balance, you will have to let go of something and hold on to something. I would say hold on to what kind of work you like to do, money will follow. That's the only thing I can say about balance. Aparna?
Ma'am, I wanted to ask, like, you said that the employee needs to find a balance, right? But what happens when it might not be the family's need, but as an individual, the child wants to, the child feels a sense of responsibility, right, within themselves, so they wouldn't want to leave the organization, right, due to their personal problems. I understand that it is necessary, but what if like the person itself does not feel safe talking about the issues with their boss and do not feel safe while leaving the job?
If I may add, I think a lot of times we confuse mental well-being with stress and anxiety and work pressure. I think what you're really talking perhaps, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I think amongst them I'm the only one who's currently working in a startup and have worked in a startup really which was a small startup which was 18, 19 employees and then now 250. Exited a startup and came back in a startup, and I understand when you say, yes, the pressures are a lot, yes, they put you in a box, yes, they don't have any way of, helping you to deal with what they expect out of you. That causes the stress, and it's very difficult sometimes to you're right, there is no safety, there is no one to talk to. So I think one of the things that you need to do for yourself is to have a boundary very clearly drawn. If you're capable of drawing that boundary, oftentimes the stress is so much that you're not even capable of figuring out how to do it. Once you draw the boundary, I think from Aparna's example, and I know Priti feels that it's difficult, but you do need to communicate that. Many organizations, even if they don't have a mental health policy in place, will have harassment and other policies in place. So you will be able to communicate, but some onus of how you're feeling and what's happening to you as a result of the work pressure will lie on you to sort of communicate it. I'm not saying they will lift it out and they will change it. It also is your sort of, because you know that it's tough for you to deal with it, you will need to find alternatives where you will survive or you will do better. You cannot, if you shut yourself down and say, I don't know what to do, you'll probably just quit and move out. But as you're saying, you have pressures, or you have to think of, how I support my family, how I support myself. Solidifying and working with yourself, as we say, leading yourself becomes an important part of how you sort of deal with the issue. Again, in many cases we are not able to, and I understand that, but in places where you're recognizing and you can take that tiny steps, do small things for yourself that will help you sort of deal with it. That's my perspective. I don't know if you want to add.
I think a lot has been said, so I would only just add that it's really helpful to be able to prioritize, and when you have a lot going on, even I tend to lose focus of priorities. The other day somebody who was working with me on a project said, and he's much younger, he said that I'm feeling stressed. So I said, okay, these are the priorities for today. Just let's work on this. Other things will follow, and if you can have that conversation with your managers, and not necessarily say, and say that, okay, what can I work on immediately? It might perhaps help to draw the boundary.
To respond to your question, and because I don't know specifics, I'll make an assumption of a case and then probably. So, assumption of a case is there's a young person who may have diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health issues, but they feel stressed and they don't think there's safety in going to family and there's no safety in going to workplaces. That's the scenario, I would say, great. One, you're recognizing where the safety is not there. Two, I would say, understand that what you're experiencing is experienced by many more people who are in similar age groups. We need to move away from mental health being an individual issue to saying it's a cohort experience. It's an experience that young adults are facing today, which is very different from when I was young, which was many years ago. And to also say, can there be support systems that you can access outside of the unsafe spaces, outside of your family, outside of your workspaces? Can you create work? Can you create support systems? May or may not be possible, but to evaluate that one. And second is, like Aparna was saying, prioritize. What is that you want? You want, as Aparna said, there was a time when she prioritized herself, saying, I need support and I need to disclose it because it's going to work for me. So prioritize when would that work for you. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's very easy for you to sit on this chair and give yarn. To be in that space would be very difficult.
I hope that helped. Anything else? We'll go with you and then we'll come this side. Okay, you have the mic, so why don't you start?
Okay, I would like to share an experience and then see what you have to say about that. So, one of my former bosses, I shared my diagnosis with my boss, my manager, or she happened to find out because I was going through a manic episode. I was made to sign an undertaking and share it with the HR. So, I don't know, is there a protocol, is there a right way to go about it? I was made to write down the medications I was taking. So yeah.
Yeah, I would not be comfortable with that at all. Definitely not.
I would say very wrong of the organization to do this because it's clearly violating personal and privacy issues. Because if you are not asking for any reasonable accommodation from the organization, there's no need to disclose it. And then it's almost putting a full power and pressure on you to do it. So I wouldn't agree to it being okay in any way.
Okay,
Even from a business side, doesn't make sense.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry you had to go through this. Yeah.
Hello. So my question is whether it is plausible for the corporates or organizations to sort of apply an intersectional lens while dealing with their employees. Is it plausible or is it too ambitious?
It is possible and it needs to be done.
Can you also elaborate how can it be done? Like how can they approach through an intersectional lens?
Sure. And I'll also promote our workplace mental health toolkit, which is on our website, where we say that you have to look at mental health from a psychosocial lens and from an intersectional lens. What it means is understanding what are unique stressors that different employees in your workforce will experience, and to have policies that address that. Simple things like we as an organization work with marginalized groups. So to say that, okay, to say we were looking at having a much more diverse team than what we have. And we realized that we were not, while we put in every JD people from marginalized backgrounds are encouraged to apply, we would put an eligibility criteria which said funding experience. Now that by itself means that only people from privileged backgrounds were sitting in these funding organizations, we would never get a CV that would meet our criteria. So then we said, we went ahead and introduced an internship program only for people from marginalized backgrounds, with the understanding that if we like someone, we would convert it into an employee. Around 75% of our interns have then been converted into employees because we took this kind of approach. And if you don't take that approach, you will never get the diverse teams that you require to be successful in the new world.
Does that answer?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Just to add to what she said, intersectionality being our major theme here. Like you talked about representation in an organization, but when we talk about mental health, like can you give an example of how it would be approachable for someone not in the privileged space to come forward and talk about their mental health, because it's double the obstacles are way much harder, right? So what is that active effort put by corporate to meet this?
So we have a disability policy which includes mental health. We have an equal opportunity policy that's available. Both of these are on our website. With every offer that we make, we include a disability policy and say, because it's possible that people will not disclose at the time of interview because it ruins their chances. Or they think their chances when it comes to MHR. So we give it after the offer, along with the offer, saying we are giving you the offer, but we are also attaching the policy in case you want us to give you now any reasonable accommodation. So it's along with the offer, so that people can feel safe. But ultimately, we have to demonstrate as an organization in our practice, and that people do share. And of course, we have mental health allowance in place. We have many other things in place. But the first step is acknowledging it. I think organizations will. Sorry.
Anything you would like to say? I'll just share a little different perspective, There's a joke actually that HR conducted a fitness test of all their employees above a certain age. And 2 out of those many employees did not have blood pressure and diabetes. And so what do? They fired those 2 people because they said that you're not working hard enough. Okay? And what I'm trying to say really over there is that it's quite easy for people to understand that physical health conditions are a direct reflection of stress, anxiety, depression, whatever we're dealing with in the corporate workplace. So one other entry into explaining what mental health is saying that is another way of the body's responding. That is the brain's response to anxiety and to depression or to stress. Those are the ways that we look at fear or sadness or the emotions that we go through. Some people respond through a physical response, a more physiological response, and some people respond through a mental or a brain health kind of response. So that is another way of just making that connection between the environment and the response to that environment.
So you're essentially saying when organizations are looking at fitness, they should look at fitness not just physically but also mentally, and then see if you put it in the same bucket, you might not find it a stigma as much as you do right now.
Yeah, and it's another way of dissociating it with personality, which is the biggest thing that happens, which is unfortunate, like in the instance that we just heard, like it was very much looking at her personality, we can't handle it and we need to sort of know all these details. I mean, if you had diabetes or something, then they're definitely not going to ask you to disclose what medication you're taking for it, right? So at least you should put it in that category of saying this is just another response to what is going on in the workplace, and look at it at least from that slightly more clinical lens. I think that is a way for people to understand it.
So we're almost at time. I think there was a question at the end.
Hi. So as ma'am actually mentioned about coming out or being open about it, there could be like two possible things. Either people can be empathic about it, or at the same time, what I feel is like majority of people don't even know anything about mental illnesses. They just know the name. And at workplace, are there any educating programs that go around letting them know about okay, these are the things that are there? Because mostly people are not from social science background, or they're not even have ever studied psychology, so they're not aware of it. So like coming out could actually have an opposite reaction also, like people may undermine their qualities, maybe can attribute their fault to their illness, and they can end up sulking it to it at the end of the day, like rather than coming out of it or reaching their potentialities. So there's something that can be introduced, or is there something that is there to educate people who are in the workplace?
So, I think very good point. In fact, the WHO and ILO just released their workplace mental health guidelines, I think it's called. It was released on 28th September. You can find it, give it to your organizations. They do say that there is evidence to show that if you educate organizations about what is mental health issues, then it benefits people with lived experience who are within the organization. So there is research to evidence that. As MHR, I'm not personally in favor of this because then it becomes a very clinical diagnosis. And getting a diagnosis by itself is a privilege. So yes, to have that is great, but with for-profit organizations and even for not-profits, I say let's talk stress, distress, because you and I have experienced it. What are things that we need for that? Do we tell everybody when I have a distress? No, I don't. I share it with few of my colleagues. Who are the people with whom I share? How much should the HR know? All these are things that can be worked out, but there should be an environment, as Aparna has been saying that psychological safety, is that the culture, is that an environment that exists? So, yes, merit in doing it. Not sure if it will give all the results that you expect.
I think what she was talking about is, should there be a training about mental health issues?
The WHO says that there is merit in doing this kind of training. Unfortunately, when trainings like this are done, they are done by clinicians, and then it becomes, are you diagnosed with mental health issues or are you not? And if I'm not diagnosed, because I don't have the privilege to have a psychiatrist who will diagnose it, then I won't get any of the policy benefits.
Aparna, anything you want to add?
I think both Priti and I are, on this whole sort of mission to kind of get workplace mental health be recognized as a topic. She does it through a lot of policy work, a lot of research work. I do it through my lived experience talks and my research on workplace mental health. So I think we are definitely at the early stages of this. But again, I would like everyone to be optimistic, because if you just look at there's been so much discussion on gender and sexuality in the corporate workplace over the years, and there's a much more evolved understanding of that. Even though we may argue that it could always be better, but there has been a progression. So I'm pretty sure that this is something, especially after the pandemic, when people are worried about losing talent, and they want to get talent back into the office, and there are all these talks of quiet quitting and great resignation and all these other things, that I feel reason to be hopeful that workplace mental health is something that will be taken seriously.
Thank you, Aparna. And on that optimistic note, I think we'll end the session here. If there's any other question, please feel free to write to the panel, and I'm sure they'll send them